Hi, I'm David Barry. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to talk to you a bit about disruptive innovation and apparently whatever that means. And the reason I get interested in that, so I've been busy, I guess, trying to start companies, and I say trying because I never know what it actually means. For the last 15 or so years, founded about 15 companies, and even though I spent some time getting an MD, PhD in there, apparently it didn't sink in because I didn't do a very good job of that. But one of the key things I want to talk about today is not just this notion of what a disruptive innovation is, but the notion that disruptive innovation at its core is actually something that, despite the name that I just used, is actually predictable, reproducible, and controllable. And when you start rethinking what disruptive innovation might actually mean, it allows you to think about entrepreneuring and this process by which we create new innovations and bring them to market in an entirely different way. And for those of you who don't believe me, I was told that this would happen, but I experienced this in a very interesting way about 2.5 weeks ago. I had my first child, and that was perhaps the single most disruptive event of my life. Thank you, thank you. But also, she's figured out all sorts of innovative ways to keep us up. So that is a classic case of disruptive innovation. But so one of the things that I got interested in, so I did my PhD with a guy by the name of Bob Langer, a Cornell alum, and he basically has built a lab that's focused on this notion of how do you start with really big problems and take technological, engineering, scientific, interdisciplinary approaches to try to solve them. And what a lot of the graduates of his lab try to do is they say, oh, I'm going to do what Bob did, and I'm going to go become a professor, and I'm going to get a lab where I get the government to give me grants, and I'm going to invent technologies and start companies. And it's a great ambition, and I set out to do exactly that when I wanted to get going. But what I realized is, well, that's not exactly the way that the world nicely works, because there's this tenure process and a whole set of things. And I stumbled my way into an organization called Flagship Ventures. And Flagship is a Cambridge, Massachusetts-based organization. We're called by some people a venture capital shop. We're called by others a parallel entrepreneuring shop. And what we really are is an intersection between the two. But for me, coming out of the Langer Lab and looking for this notion of how I can get into inventing technology and starting companies, this idea of a place that had about $800 million in management wanting to support someone who was doing just that, it's kind of a cool idea. So I joined there in around 2005 and have been working on that ever since. So what we do at the end of the day is we have a dedicated method that we've been honing over the past 14 or so years to engage in the concept of predictable, disruptive innovation. And on the back end, we have our own fund in which we can support these concepts. Now, the notion of disruptive innovation starts from this concept of how do you actually innovate? Now, of course, we all hear the quote of the best way to have good ideas is to have a lot of ideas. But the challenge whenever you have an idea is you never know, well, how good your idea is at the start. And one of the bigger challenges that a lot of folks have when they're trying to start a company is you actually don't want to know how big an idea is. You like to assume it's a really good idea. You like to assume it's a really big idea. But the challenge is, when you start your company, and let's say you get funded, this is your source of your living. And if you ask that critical question that's going to kill your company, and you get the answer you don't want, what's your alternative? It's unemployment. And if you think about what serial entrepreneurs do really, really well, is they put a higher and higher bar around each startup, each progressive startup that they do, to basically make sure that they're not wasting the one commodity that they have that they can't get back, which is time. And in that way, when you start thinking about what goodness is, it's really that survivability. And trying to figure out ways that you can find the good, kill the bad quickly allows you to get into the notion of really sustainable innovation in a fast way. So we've built a dedicated unit at Flagship that is focused on this. What our goal is basically through a dedicated process to come up with innovations that we think can disrupt a whole series of industries. We've built a team of 15 or so technically trained or primarily technically trained folks, along with expertise in IP, expertise in finance, that allows us through an iterative process to come up with a series of companies. The good thing about our process and having slides like this is they're always wrong. We're now at about 29 companies, and the amount of capital is actually a little closer to $2 billion at this point. But that's neither here nor there. It's just fun that it's always out of date. And part of what this is trying to challenge some of the models of what innovation is. Because when you get into these concepts of how to think about innovation, there's either a pressure on being unique or a pressure on being financially sound. And what we want to make sure of when we're coming up with our innovations is that you can actually be both. So I'll tell you a little bit about what our process is. So we start out with something that we call an exploration. An exploration is actually initiated by a question. And that question can be absolutely anything. There's no good question. There's no bad question. And what we do is we take one senior team member and one or two junior team members, and we try to unearth everything we can about a subject. And we don't give ourselves much time. We try to do that in about 4 weeks. And what's interesting about that is you find that the first thing you do is you separate truth from belief. And what I mean by that is if you go into any field, there's a lot of stuff that's known, and it's really important to understand what that is because you want to stand on the shoulders of giants. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that simply said it's BS. And the reason it's there is because of citation bias. And what I mean by that is some smart person may have said something entirely well-meaning, but the next person who quoted that person didn't check the reference, and they didn't check the context in which something was said. And so that becomes something that gets said over and over and over again. And the interesting thing is if you say something against it and you're in academia, people say you're wrong and you can't get your papers published. And if you support it, great. You get brought into the society. So it's almost a self-selecting process. I'll give you a great example of this, and it's a little heretical for me to say it, which is there is a notion that the cause of cancer is genetic mutation. And this is interesting because this comes from a paper in around 1973 where Bob Weinberg basically showed that if you insert oncogenes into cells, you can give them a cancer phenotype, which shows basically sufficiency but not necessity. Now that's become lore, and probably everyone was taught that in a biology class at some point. Everyone believes that, and probably everyone's thinking that I'm completely crazy for saying this. Harvey Lodish in 2010 showed very simply put that he could create cancer cells that had no genetic mutations. So this starts to change the way we start to think about things. And I use that as an extreme example, not to say that there's big innovation in there, but the point is that if you rest on what people simply tell you and you don't truly understand the difference between truth and belief, you're going to get yourself caught in something where you're falling down a path that takes you towards some form of error. And that's a really important piece. Then after we start to understand this, we engage basically our network in a process where we form what we call a venture hypothesis. So after having this information, we make basically a hypothesis of what we think is interesting. Those hypotheses simply don't matter. So you could start from your question and just put out 15 different hypotheses. Ideally, they're crazy. And then what we do is we tap our network and we ask our network not what they think is interesting in an area, but what they think of our ideas. And the great thing about this is the second greatest renewable resource on Earth after the sun is people's willingness to tell you how bad your idea is. And so we've made a living out of basically harnessing this resource. Because what's great, when you put out an idea and someone tells you what's wrong with it, you get a whole set of new fact patterns. You take that, you put it against all your ideas, you start iterating. And you start looking at the directions that they're all going, and it helps you basically triangulate towards a common, if you will, venture hypothesis. So along this process, we're killing a lot of ideas, we're morphing a lot of ideas, and what we ultimately form is a single concerted venture hypothesis. The single hypothesis has to have some sort of intersection between innovation, technological, market, it doesn't matter. There's a number of different types of innovation. A market opportunity, a strategy for protection, which is usually based around patents or other forms of intellectual property, and a path by which it can actually be developed. And what we then do is we don't start the company. We actually ask the next question, which is, what thing, if it were not true, would kill the company? And the next phase is dedicated to trying to run down that path. Our next 6 months after this first phase is dedicated to doing nothing but killing the company. And again, related to what I was talking about earlier, I call this basically trying to solve the mother-in-law problem. Now, it's not the problem we all want to solve with the mother-in-law problem, but it's the notion of when you tell your mother-in-law you have a job during Christmas, and then in Easter you say you're unemployed, well, you don't look too good in front of your mother-in-law. This is a good way of solving that. But what ends up happening is as you start killing these, you again are iterating the idea that you have. And it's through this process where you can't actually kill your idea, where the ecosystem around you, the top professors, the top business folk, et cetera, can't tell you what's wrong with your idea, then you say you have something. And usually what starts to happen, and this is when you can start telling that you have something that's pretty interesting, is a lot of these experts who've told you how bad your idea is start saying, you know, that's kind of interesting. And if you do something, I'd love to work with you. All of a sudden, you know you have something. And that gets kind of exciting, and that's when you want to start the company. At that point, that's when we start launching something. So we've gone through that method now nearly basically 30 times. What the arrows here denote are not spin-outs, but one of the beautiful things that happens is when you start a company in an area, and this goes actually back to our founding, you actually know more about that area than just about anyone else. And what it allows us to do is experiment in that space of the adjacent possible and build, if you will, new and further innovations. And that's one of the things that we've been doing pretty continuously. So it's allowed us to pick areas where we have strong expertise. The other thing that's unique about the way we do this is we pride ourselves on patents. In the life sciences and sustainability industries, patents are the lifeblood of any company. We have at Flagship, and this is somewhat unique in a venture capital setting, 165 plus issued patents and close to about 1,000 follow-ons that have been filed. And this is something that we do time and time again. So I'll tell you about a couple of things that we've been working with relatively recently and give you a little bit of sense of where this is going. So around 2007, we got interested in this thing called the microbiome. This is the organisms that inhabit us. And what we got interested in this was, well, we didn't know. But we got interested because an expert in sequencing, Claire Fraser, had told us that she was going to go sequence the microbiome. So we said, hey, let's go look at the microbiome. That was our question. What we then started was basically a set of explorations, understood not much was known, initiated basically a proto company. First proto company was trying to basically sequence the microbiome and develop diagnostics, shut that down. We then developed another proto company that was focused on looking at the molecules that come from these bacteria, shut that down. We started another proto company that was focused on this emergent biology in 2010, which is a little off color, called fecal transplantation. We shut that down. Probably a good thing. But then we had this really interesting idea because we realized, and this goes back to the sort of getting the truth and getting the belief, and we just didn't understand it yet, was we realized everyone was looking left and the real biology was towards the right, which is that what everyone was doing was collecting postage stamps. They were trying to name all the organisms that are in the gut. But the biology is not about the names of organisms. It's about function. And that's not a surprise, because if you go to your doctor, they don't go and measure the number of liver cells you have. They don't measure the number of brain cells you have. They make sure your liver works. They make sure your brain works. And so in the same notion, we really should be caring about the function of the microbiome. And that was our insight. And we realized that if we could understand this substrate, and we could actually intervene in this way and characterize health and disease, we could develop a new kind of therapeutic. And long story short, I won't get into too much detail, we started a company called Series Health that was focused on exactly this concept. And basically, the company has now taken the concept. It was founded in 2011. We opened our lab in 2012. We started a clinical trial in 2013. We got data back middle of this year that showed a 97% clinical cure rate with no detectable side effects in a disease where the standard of care is 30% success. And obviously, we're pretty excited. We'll move it into phase 3 a little later this year. The disease is recurrent Clostridium difficile infection. But it's opening up this whole opportunity and rethinking the way that infectious disease occurs. So that was one thing that we were excited about. Another company we got started on, this started in 2010. So we asked the question, anytime you hear people who develop drugs talk, they always lament how expensive it is and how long it takes. And so we asked the question, you could say this is another one of those stupid questions. Well, how do I make this faster? How do I make it shorter? How do I make it more predictable? And it turns out what we found when we started doing our exploration, we found these two really interesting case studies. One is on this thing called Lavazza, otherwise known as fish oil, and another is on this thing called niaspan, otherwise known as niacin. And what's interesting about both of these is the product is actually found in the food stream. So what the FDA allows you to do is if something is in food, if you want to go on ahead and test it to be a potential food or a supplement, you do a very short path that gets you into the clinic. Basically, it could be a couple of months. It's a couple of animal studies and whatnot. And then you can test it and see if you get an effect in man. You can see if you get a safety study in man. Now, that's interesting because all of a sudden you can go from concept to clinic in 3-4 months, whereas it usually takes you about 3-4 years. And you can get human data, which is usually something that takes you closer to 5-6 years in that same amount of time. So we asked this question of, well, this is really cool. How do we systematize this? And we came up with this insight that given that people have been understanding that amino acids can drive biology, and this is actually pretty broadly understood, but it's kind of funny, the average bodybuilder will go around talking about isoleucine, leucine, and valine, and how it, quote, they made this into a verb, mTorque your muscles, which is pretty exciting. But there's this long history of known physiology, and it extends well beyond that. So what we ended up doing was basically going to Whole Foods, buying every single food we could get our hands on, pure foods, breaking them down in the lab, running them on a mass spec, and built a library that has about 1 billion foodborne proteins. And we built a computational approach to basically say, what do you want? What amino acids do you want? Over what period of time? And it allows us to predict what protein that when you put it in the mouth will digest, release those amino acids, and have a physiological effect. So we've now launched this company. We've done, after building the platform, we've now gotten 4 leads, tested in 5 clinical trials across 3 therapeutic areas. And we do each one basically from concept to clinical data for somewhere around $500,000, which is completely off the charts low compared to what you typically see in life sciences. So those are just a couple of examples. We're working on some interesting adjacencies to those. But one of the things that we've started thinking a lot about is this notion that often when innovation is done, often when people are in this space of entrepreneuring, they do it in isolation. They're in their garage, they're somewhere, they talk to some people, but they don't really think about the ecosystem in which they exist. But what's interesting is the number of small companies that actually grow up to fully commercialize their product as a large company is incredibly small. It's the vast minority. What happens to most small companies who actually commercialize a product is they get bought or the product gets licensed. And usually when the technology is being developed, when the business plan is being instantiated, that isn't really thought about. But what's more interesting about that is it's not all about just that concept. It's the notion of, well, where are we trying to go ultimately? And when you think about the adjacency to this, you realize there's this whole space in manufacturing where what manufacturers do is they give up material, non-public information to people they call suppliers or their other manufacturers, and they say to them, we need this part, we need this specification. And that partner goes and they actually make it for them. And it creates this thing we've all learned about, probably called a supply chain. And the manufacturing supply chain turns out to be a highly efficient concept. In innovation, though, this has historically been broken. If you go to the big company in a field and you ask them, what do you need? What do you want to fill your gap? Either they don't know or they don't want to tell you in an honest way. And what you find is that you have an innovation cycle that starts to get broken. And part of this comes from this notion that the innovation cultures and the modes of innovation are entirely different. But the bigger issue is that they've been totally disconnected. And so one of the things that we've been starting to try to develop and develop much more efficiently is this notion of an innovation supply chain, where you can connect the dots from innovator to company builder to end user, or if you will, end purchaser, and then ultimately to end user, where all the stakeholders are brought together such that you're actually thinking about the end product in a pretty interesting way from day one. And what you have to do in order to get that right is make sure that your incentive structure is right, because no one's going to entrepreneur unless you really believe that you can have an outsized reward for the risk you're taking. And no one wants to overpay for an innovation that doesn't yet exist. So as long as you can create this innovation structure that actually works, you're going to be set. The good thing is there's industries that have solved this. People talk about the movie industry as an example of this. It's emerging actually a little bit in the biotech industry, and it's emerging a little bit in some parts of the tech industry. But we see one of the big trends that's going to be taking place is this much more efficient supply chain around innovation, and that's one of the areas that we've actually been trying to push on going forward. So thank you for your time and attention, and obviously happy to take questions.
Thanks, Dave. So let's see. Let's turn it over to the audience and see if anyone has questions. They're going to pop up on the screen, right? So people put them in there. Can I give one while we wait? Oh, okay, there you go. Or not. All right, let's see. So when you launch a company, how do you balance your time now, including your new daughter, latest disruptive innovation?
My wife's not listening, right? So that's always an interesting question, and I actually love using the fact that time is limited as a guiding principle, because there's too many ideas out there and there's not enough time to pursue them all. So one of the things I actually found this when I was a bit younger and earlier in my career, you'd wake up in the middle of the night with a great idea, and the first thing you want to do is write it down. So I used to keep something by my bed, and I'd write down the ideas. By the way, I learned that every single idea I had in the middle of the night was horrible, absolutely horrible. I don't know why, but it was. So what I started to realize is, you know what? I actually don't want to write anything down, because that which you can remember, that which you can think of, it's actually a great selecting function. So what I tend to do is I just allow my ability to focus or not actually guide what I'm doing. So I tend not to try to start more than 2 companies at a time. One is a better place to start, but 2 is the maximum because I have an ADD problem. And what I end up trying to do is I surround myself with outstanding people. Because at the end of the day, even in one company, you can't do it all by yourself, and it's about the team at the end of the day. So really what I try to do is focus on what I'm good at, bring people around me that can do what they're really good at, and work in a team fashion. I haven't figured out how to get my daughter to work at these companies yet, but the second I can, that'll be another set of hands. I hope my wife didn't hear that.
One other quick question on the talent side of this. So do you have a lot of the same people working across projects, or do you really make sure that others besides you are only focused on one at a time?
It's a really good question. So we look for dedicated talent that's going to focus on any one of these particular efforts. Now, the reality is people have a limited attention span and frankly, I hate to say this, but a limited phase in which they're actually relevant for companies. And the notion partly when you get into a supply chain, and the movie industry, again, does this really well. A screenwriter writes the script. They don't then, well, maybe some annoying ones do. They don't then act as the second character or something along those lines. Whereas in a lot of companies, you get someone who comes in early and they want to stick around forever because we've created these incentives, these vesting schedules, and it takes people in the wrong direction. But when people are no longer doing what they need to do and their skill set's no longer necessary, we should have actually already paid them for what they're doing and move them on to the next thing. So one of the things we do think about is actually moving talent from company to company at the point when they become most useful for that next company, and keep it all, if you will, within a tightly knit family.
Makes sense. And related to another question, which I think is a good one here. So you talked about a bunch of companies you had to kill and kill and kill before you got to one that had legs. How do you know when it's time to kill those companies versus nurture them, help them pivot, keep them alive?
Well, said simply, I'd rather kill a company than start one. Because if you start a company and you start wrong, you waste years of your life, you waste millions of investor dollars, and frankly, no one wants that. So usually what ends up happening, for me at least, it's you wake up one morning and you're just not excited anymore. And the second I start to feel that, it either means you got to iterate or you got to kill it. And one of the things that we've actually gotten, I think, set up quite well is this notion that you can never be passionate about your idea until you're ready to launch it. Now, it's important to be passionate about your idea once you launch it, but you have to be objective about it beforehand. And once you can separate yourself from that passion and look at something and say, this just isn't really cutting it, then you can know to kill. There isn't a clear signal, but you have to have the gut instinct to be able to figure that out.
There was another question further down about whether or not the model you described to us is relevant beyond the industry that you're focused on to folks in other industries in here. How would you answer that?
So I think the approach that we think about is actually relevant for any industry. It just becomes the notion of the speed of the cycle. I mean, the tech industry has moved somewhat adjacent to this in that they talk about pivoting and things along those lines. Usually that to me means you have an idea and then you realize you didn't like it, so you do something totally different, and you convince someone to give you enough money to do a lot of ideas. What we try to do is keep it adjacent. And that notion of being adjacent is actually, I think it's relevant to just about anything. I mean, we've been able to do it in sustainability, biotech, food and nutrition, tech, and a range of other industries to date. So I think it's pretty broadly applicable.
There are a couple of questions around the capital raising side, how you value a company at the seed stage, how much capital do your companies typically raise? Can you give us a sense of that?
Sure, so there's no answer. The way I look at it, and this always is a fun part of starting a company. So when we have to value a company, my job as a CEO is to reduce the cost of capital. This is the way I describe what a CEO's job should be. And so at the end of the day, you have to negotiate with someone who's going to give you money, and my job is to make the price as high as possible. Now, you might say, well, I sit on the other side, and I have this venture job, so I also want to keep the price as low as possible. But for the point when I'm starting a company, I'm the CEO, and I try to drive that value. The way that you drive value is that which you can convince someone else to pay. And the way that I can drive value even internally is if I can get someone on the outside who's willing to pay a price. So there is no rule. I mean, if you look in any industry, there's relative standards that seem average, but at the end of the day, I get whatever price I can warrant.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here about the source of the ideas. You talked about the funnel and how many you whittle down to the ones you focus on, but where do they actually come in the first place? Or is there some point where you're all brainstorming and just throwing things up on the board?
Usually less than you'd think. So usually we start with a question. And where do these questions come from? Well, one was an example where we just came up with a big, broad idea. Another was someone told us something interesting. We've had some crazy questions out there. At one point, someone threw out the idea of, can we make chocolate better? That hasn't gone anywhere yet, but it's been something we've thought about. And so there's no real basis for that. But once you start understanding the landscape, what we try to do is just lay out every single hypothesis. So it's not whiteboarding. It's actually meant to cover white space. And what we don't want to do, we don't want to be overly creative in the early days. We want to be exhaustive. And in that way, you start, it's almost, if you think about it from the engineering perspective, it's this notion of trying to understand what the potential space is. And then you let the information you get about potential space tell you where potential answers are. So it becomes almost a self-honing process.
And I think we have time for one more question. This is an interesting one. So there are a lot of players in the innovation supply chain that you described. How do you allocate value amongst them? I guess they each play a different role in the different type of life cycle of a company.
It's an important question, and this is part of the reason why I think a lot of these innovation supply chains don't fully exist as of yet. The notion of how you define value, especially a priori, involves a little bit of mutual risk. Part of the reason I referenced the movie industry is they've actually done a reasonable job at this, where everyone along the way, from the actors to the screenwriters to the directors, they tend to have a pre-negotiated piece that, unless you're a A-lister or something along those lines, you kind of know what it's going to be ahead of time. And the job you're going to do is pretty well defined ahead of time. Now, that's not the entirety of it, but it's interesting because you can actually, if you start looking at the holistic model of, take drug development as an example, because it's an easily stage-gateable model. You can say, all right, a preclinical compound tends to have a value between this and this range. Phase 1 compound has a value between this and this range. Phase 2 between these ranges. Phase 3 here. And you can use that to start saying, all right, with whatever sort of reasonable bounding, I can start guessing with some accuracy at what the value at that time is. And so you can start putting yourself in positions where both sides are a little bit uncomfortable and say what that value is. Now, there's a value for distribution. There's a value for creation. And it's literally where that transition starts taking over, where the value, I think, that value transaction starts to occur.
Dave Barry, everyone, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.